everybody, Mrs. Hales here with your next art lesson. Today we're starting a unit on colonial art. This unit is going to be 3 lessons long, and we're going to also explore some Native American art during this time because it's the same time period in history in America. So it's from about 1600 or 1605 to 1775, 1776. So we're going to look at what the colonial Americans or the settlers were making, and then we're also going to look at some art and artifacts that the Native Americans created. We're going to talk a little bit about art versus craft because that's very important to understand the difference between those two things. And we're going to talk about how we know what the Native Americans and what the colonists or settlers created. How do we know that? So let's get started. So anytime a culture makes art, or you could say anything crafty, crafts, they're making things and they're reflecting the time in which they live. So for example, you wouldn't find art from today made 300 years ago. It wouldn't be possible. We didn't have a lot of art today is made on computers. They didn't have computers 300 years ago. We have a lot of different materials to paint with that have like plastics in them. We hadn't invented plastics 300 years ago. So artwork that is made today wouldn't have been possible back then. A lot of time when artists make art, they're trying to perfect or get as good as they can be at a certain technique. For example, it might be your goal as a portrait painter to paint super realistic portraits. But a lot of times artists are breaking new boundaries and experimenting with the materials that they're using or the techniques that they're trying or what they're trying to communicate. So a lot of art is doing things that have never been done before in the art world. And that's sometimes what makes good art good art. Now compare that to or contrast that to crafts. Crafts are usually things that we use. So for example, most Native American traditions across this country made pottery because they had to have vessels to eat and drink out of and to cook with. So a lot of Native American tribes have a history with working with clay. So that would be an example of craft. So usually crafts, sometimes you can be doing experimental things and breaking new ground with crafts, but usually crafts are made to be used, whereas art objects are, they're created to make you think, or they're created to make you see the world in a new way or notice something beautiful. So they're created kind of for a different purpose. And this isn't true today, but certainly hundreds of years ago, the average person who may or may not have known how to read and write didn't have access to art for the most part. Art was created for people with money who were educated, and it was oftentimes created by people who had a certain education in the arts. Now, crafts were made for everybody to use, regardless of if you had an education, because everybody needs to have a quilt or a blanket. Everybody needs to have vessels to eat and drink out of. So that's another difference between fine art and craft. This portrait of George Washington would be considered fine art, as would this early American landscape painting. And this silver teapot would also be considered fine art. So some colonial American crafts would be a penny rug, which is made from scraps of fabric, a crazy quilt, which is also made from scraps of fabric. Something that's really difficult to see on a crazy quilt is the stitches that hold the pieces of fabric together are very elaborate and fancy. Some examples of Native American crafts include vessels like pottery for drinking or eating out of. This is a silver pipe that Native Americans used to smoke tobacco out of. Native Americans from many different tribes wove baskets to carry things from the garden. Beadwork on moccasins or clothing is an example of Native American crafts, or beadwork on a pouch like this leather carrying bag. So you can see in some of the crafts, either from the colonial crafts like the crazy quilt or the Native American pottery, or the beautiful beaded moccasins. Even though they are crafts, they are still beautiful and creative and have an artistic part to them, or an artistic element to them. So some of the paintings and the silver teapots and things like that, some of those things have survived, for hundreds of years, and there is an artist's name assigned to them, and we can just based on what we know about art history and history in general, we can figure out when they were alive and when they painted or made the teapot or whatever. And sometimes archaeologists dig up or uncover different artifacts from the past. And so that's another way that we can learn about the past, through archaeologists, through historians. So a painting, obviously, that's been signed by someone and has a date on it, that would be a primary source document, in the same way that the Declaration of Independence is a primary source document, or a book that someone wrote. So those are all examples of primary source documents. So today our art project is going to be using a metalwork technique called repoussé. And that's a French word that means to push through from the back, or the reverse side of metal. If you were going to work on the top of a piece of metal or the outside, that would be called chasing or engraving. But when you're working from the back and you want to punch something through, that's called repoussé. Now, the British colonists brought this technique and the techniques of working in metal over with them when they came from England. A famous metalsmith that you may have heard of was named Paul Revere. He was the guy who rode from town to town up outside Boston, Massachusetts, saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Well, he was also a metalsmith. That's what he did for his career or his living. He made things out of metal for people, like silverware and teapots and dishes, things like that. Supplies that you need today are a 6x6 piece of aluminum foil from your pantry or your drawer, wherever you keep your aluminum foil. If you can't cut a 6x6 inch square, have one of your parents help you. You need a dull pencil. It's really important that your pencil is dull. We're going to be drawing on our foil, and if your pencil isn't dull, you could punch a hole through. How do you make your pencil dull if it's not? I push down really, really, really hard on just some scrap paper, and I rotate my pencil around so it's not pointy in an area. So it's kind of dull and very rounded all the way around. So you can see my pencil has gotten a little bit more dull. You need an 8x8 or an 8x10 inch piece of colored construction paper, and that you're going to glue your finished repoussé piece down onto. You need a glue stick, and you also need something to push down on the tinfoil width that's going to go underneath that, because your table's probably too hard. So you can have 4 or 5 pieces of like construction paper. If you have any fabric, you could put a piece of felt or even a t-shirt. You could put a t-shirt, smooth it out, and put that underneath your aluminum foil. And that's all you need. I also did just a rough sketch. So if you want to do a sketch on a piece of scrap paper with your pencil, you're welcome to do that, or you can just go straight to working on your aluminum foil. So remember, you want to start with a pretty dull, rounded pencil. I made just a basic sketch. Now you can't repeat that or trace that onto your foil, but it'll give you some ideas of what you want to put on your repoussé piece. A pineapple is a traditional colonial symbol for welcome, so I thought I would draw a pineapple on there. You can do any designs from geometry, like shapes like squares, triangles, or rectangles, or you could do things from nature like leaves, flowers. You could do a landscape scene. You could do animals. You're going to turn your foil over and work on the back, which in this case is going to be the shiny side. So you're going to be drawing on the shiny side, which is the back. Now, notice also that I have about 10 pieces of construction paper underneath my foil. This is allowing the foil to give a little bit when I draw on it, and that's what's making it possible for me to make the impression in the foil. You can also use a piece of fabric like a t-shirt or some felt for this to put under your foil. You want to make sure you fill in as much of the 6x6 or 5x5 inch tinfoil square as you can. You don't want to leave a lot of empty spaces. I went back in here and put some straight lines radiating out away from my pineapple. All finished drawing your design on tinfoil. You're going to, from the back, put a little bit of glue on the edges of your foil and then put some glue stick in the middle of your construction paper. I have black, but you might have a color. You just need a little bit of glue to help the foil stick because it's so thin and lightweight. So you're gonna flip it over so that your design is... Alrighty, everybody. That's about all I have for you today, other than when you're gluing your finished piece of repoussé foil onto your construction paper, make sure that the dull side is up. If you drew on the shiny side, which should have been the back, make sure the duller side of the foil is up. Your designs and your drawings should be raised. They should be coming out towards the viewer or raised so that when you feel them, you can feel bumps. I will see you next time.